The morning Grace Monroe noticed the stranger's saddle was coming apart. She almost said nothing, almost let him ride out of Harlan's crossing the same way every other drifter had, with nothing behind him but dust and indifference. It was the spring of 1882 in the New Mexico Territory, and Harlan's crossing sat stubborn and sun-bleached at the edge of the Cimarron River, the kind of town that had survived Apache raids, drought, and the slow creep of the railroad that had bypassed it entirely 3 years prior, and left it to quietly decide whether it wanted to live or die. The town had chosen, in its ornery fashion, to live, though just barely, like a man breathing through one nostril after a bad fight. Grace had been running the livery stable and small leather goods shop at the south end of town for 2 years, ever since her husband Thomas had been taken by a fever that came fast and left no room for goodbyes. She was 31 years old, with hands that carried the particular roughness of a woman who had learned every task her husband once performed, because there was no one else to perform them. She had dark brown hair that she wore pinned back tightly during the day, loose only at night when she sat by the window of the small house attached to the stable and read by lamplight. Her eyes were the color of creek water in the shade, not quite green, not quite gray, and she had a way of looking at things, horses especially, with a steadiness that animals trusted immediately. She was pulling a broken bridle apart at the work table near the stable entrance that morning when the rider came in. He came in the way men came in who had been on the trail long enough to be indifferent to arrival, no particular interest in the town, no lifting of the hat brim to assess the place. He just rode in, slow and tired, on a handsome roan gelding that was in considerably better condition than its rider. The man himself was lean in the way of men who ate when they found food, and did not think much about it otherwise. He wore a dusty canvas coat the color of old pine bark, and his hat was pulled low enough that Grace caught his face only in pieces at first, the jaw carrying several days of dark stubble, the mouth set in the neutral line of a man accustomed to keeping his own counsel. He could not have been more than 35, though the trail had a way of adding years to a face, and she did not assume. He tied the roan to the post outside with a quiet word to the animal that she did not catch, and then he walked into the stable office where Grace was working, and he asked, without preamble, what it cost to put a horse up for the night and whether there was a decent farrier in town. 50 cents for the stall, feed included, Grace said. Farrier is Hector Ruiz, second building past the Mercantile. He is good if you can find him sober before noon. The man nodded as though this was exactly the kind of information he had expected, useful but qualified. I appreciate it, he said. He paid her and went back out to see to his horse, and Grace returned to the bridle. It was only when he brought the roan inside and was removing the tack that she saw the saddle. He had not seen it himself, or if he had not understood what he was looking at. The left rigging strap, the leather piece that connected the cinch ring to the saddle tree, had been compromised where it attached to the D-ring. The stitching had frayed over time in the particular way that happened when a saddle was ridden hard without adequate care of the leather, and 3 of the waxed linen stitches had already pulled through entirely. The 4th was holding, but only in the manner of a man standing on one leg on the edge of a cliff. If he rode out on that saddle and the strap let go while he was moving at any kind of speed, the saddle would roll, and a rolled saddle on a moving horse was the sort of thing that could kill a man cleanly, without apology or ceremony. Grace set down the bridle. She looked at the saddle again. She looked at the man, who was talking to his horse in that low, private way he had, running a hand down the roan's nose while the animal leaned into him with familiar trust. She did not say anything. She did not make a deliberate decision, exactly. She simply reached up to the shelf where she kept her awl and her spool of heavy wax thread and her curved leather needle, and she lifted the saddle off the rail where he had set it, carried it to the work table, and got to work. She cleaned the damaged section first, trimming away the frayed threads with her small knife until the leather was ready to hold new work properly. Then she punched the holes through with the awl, finding the existing channels where she could, and she began the saddle stitch, the double thread stitch that held because each loop locked the other, so that even if one thread cut through, the seam would not unravel. She worked carefully and without hurry, because hurrying on a saddle stitch was how you made weak work, and weak work on a cinch strap was the same as no work at all. The man came into the stable some time later looking for something in his saddlebag and stopped when he saw her at the work table with his saddle. "What are you doing?" he asked, not unkindly, genuinely uncertain. "Your rigging strap was coming apart," Grace said, not looking up. "If you had ridden any distance on it, you would have lost the saddle." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the work, assessing it, and she did not mind. She was not seeking his approval. She was finishing a seam. "I did not ask you to do that," he said. "No," Grace agreed. "You did not." Another silence. She set another stitch, pulled the thread through both directions until it seated cleanly. "My name is Calvin Redmond," he said. "Grace Monroe," she replied. "I own the livery." "I can see that," Calvin said. He came closer and looked at the stitching she had already completed, and she saw his expression shift from uncertain to something quieter. "That is good work," he said. "I know," said Grace without vanity, because it was simply true. He paid her when she was finished, though she had not asked him to, and she did not argue about it because a woman running a business on her own did not turn away fair compensation. He saddled the roan the next morning and rode out before Grace had finished her coffee, and she watched him go from the stable doorway and felt the particular small sadness of watching something leave that you had not expected to mind about, and then she went back inside and got on with the day. She was certain she would not see him again. Men passed through Harlan's crossing the way water passed through dry ground briefly, leaving less trace than you expected. She was wrong. Calvin Redmond was 3 miles out of town, heading north along the Cimarron toward the crossroads at Mora, when he felt it. He felt the difference in the saddle, the precise and intentional tightness of the new stitching under the left fender, the way the leather sat firm against the D-ring, without any of the subtle giving that had been bothering him for weeks, without his understanding what it was. He had ridden with that slight wrongness so long he had stopped feeling it consciously, the way you stopped hearing a clock after a while, and now it was gone, replaced with something solid and careful and right. He pulled the roan up, standing in the middle of the trail with the morning sun coming sideways through the cottonwoods along the creek bank, and he thought about the woman at the work table who had fixed something without being asked, who had done it thoroughly and well, and without making any particular occasion of it. He sat there long enough that the roan turned his head back to look at him with one large dark eye, clearly questioning the delay. Calvin Redmond turned his horse around. He told himself it was because he owed her a proper thanks, and that he had been raised by a mother who would have been embarrassed by him if she knew he had ridden off without a proper acknowledgement. He told himself it was good manners and nothing else. He was a man who was reasonably practiced at lying to himself when the truth was inconvenient, but he was also a man who recognized the lie for what it was while he was telling it, which was its own particular kind of honesty. He rode back into Harlan's crossing and tied the roan at the post again and walked into the livery stable, where Grace was measuring a length of leather with a brass rule. She looked up when she heard the boots on the wooden floor, and something crossed her face, surprise mostly, and something underneath the surprise that was more carefully kept. "You came back," she said. "I felt the stitch on the trail," Calvin said. He took his hat off. He was not entirely sure why he did that, but it felt necessary. "I wanted to say thank you properly." "You paid me," Grace said. "I did not pay you to thank you," Calvin said. "I paid you because you did work that was worth paying for. Those are two different things." Grace set down the brass rule. She looked at him with those creekwater eyes, and he had the peculiar sensation of being assessed honestly, without performance or pretense on either side. "All right," she said. "You are welcome, Calvin Redmond. Now, did you come all the way back to Harlan's crossing just for that, or do you have actual business here?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. He had not, he realized, thought past the turning of the horse. He looked around the livery, at the worn but well-kept equipment, at the signs on the wall listing the services and prices in a handwriting that was precise and practical, at the house door visible through the back of the stable. "I suppose I do not have other business," he admitted. "Then you must be hungry," Grace said, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who had grown up in a part of the world where feeding a person who showed up at your door was not sentiment. It was just the thing you did. "I was about to heat up what was left from last night." It was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. They would have called it breakfast, which was simpler and safer and also true. Calvin had been a cattle drover most of his adult life, working for various outfits across Texas and the New Mexico territory, moving beef from the grazing land to the railheads at Trinidad and Las Vegas. He was good at the work in the way of a man who has found the thing he is suited to by constitution. The long days in the saddle did not wear at him. The solitude of the range did not erode him. The particular rhythm of a cattle drive, which was mostly patience punctuated by brief stretches of chaos, suited the way his mind worked. He had drifted through life with the comfortable self-sufficiency of a man who had never been given a compelling reason to stop drifting. He had been between jobs for 3 weeks now, having finished a drive for the Harrington outfit out of Cimarron, and found himself in that strange loose interval that always followed a completed drive, money in his pocket. No immediate obligation. The whole territory open in front of him with nothing to specifically recommend one direction over another. He told Grace some of this over breakfast, not the personal parts, not the inner life of it, but the practical facts, the outline, and she listened in the way she did things, which was attentively and without needing to fill the silence with noise. She ate her own food with quiet appetite and asked questions only when she had genuine ones. She told him about the livery, about how she had learned the leatherwork from Thomas before he got sick, how she had expanded the shop, because she discovered she was better at it than she had expected, how the town had been at first uncertain about a widow running a business, and had gradually arrived at a kind of pragmatic acceptance because she was good at what she did and reasonably priced and open 6 days a week. They were not unkind about it exactly, Grace said, looking out the small kitchen window at the back end of the livery. Just uncertain. A woman running a business by herself is one of those things that makes people feel like something is slightly out of place, even when they cannot articulate what they would prefer instead. "Do you have family nearby?" Calvin asked. "My sister is in Santa Fe," Grace said. "She has 3 children and a husband who works for the territorial government. She writes to me regularly and worries about me regularly, which is not the same thing as being nearby." She said it without bitterness, just as fact. "My parents are gone. Thomas had a brother in Texas, but we were not close after Thomas died. People manage grief in their own directions." Calvin nodded. He understood the landscape of loss, how it scattered people as often as it gathered them. "And you?" Grace asked. "Do you have family?" "Mother passed when I was 19, Calvin said. "Father before that. I have a sister in Colorado, married well, lives a life I could not have predicted for either of us when we were children." He paused. "We write when we remember to, which is not as often as we should." Grace looked at him with that steady regard. "You are a lone-running man," she said, "not a judgment." "An observation." "I suppose I am," Calvin said. He stayed in Harlan's crossing for another night and then another after that without ever quite deciding to stay. He helped Grace with a particularly difficult mule that came in needing shoes and was not disposed toward cooperation, and he turned out to have a patience with difficult animals that Grace noticed and respected, because patience with animals was not a performance animals knew immediately if it was false. He ate supper at her kitchen table twice more. He began talking to the men who came to the livery in the way of a man who was becoming familiar with a place rather than passing through it. On the 4th morning, Frank Hensler, who ran the General Mercantile 2 doors down, offered Calvin $1 a day to help unload 2 freight wagons that had come in from Las Vegas, and Calvin accepted before he had thought about whether accepting meant he was staying. He was staying. He had not made the decision, but his body had made it ahead of him, which was a thing he had noticed before about himself, that his instincts moved ahead of his intentions, and he generally did better when he listened to them. Harlan's Crossing in the spring of 1882 was a town of approximately 200 souls, with the particular demographics of a small frontier settlement. A higher proportion of men than women, a scattering of Mexican families who had been there since before the territory changed hands, and who regarded the newer Anglo population with the patient wariness of people who had seen governments come and go. A handful of former Confederate soldiers who had drifted west after the war looking for country that did not remind them of what they had lost, and the general miscellany of frontier life drifters, small ranchers, a blacksmith named Pete Dawson, a doctor named Elias Croft who had come out from Missouri 15 years ago and seemed to have forgotten there was anywhere else to go. The town also had its share of problems, which Calvin learned gradually and unsurprisingly. The Hargrove brothers Burrell and Cole ran a cattle operation 10 miles north of town and conducted their business with the particular arrogance of men who had enough money to be accustomed to small authorities looking away from them. They had a habit of letting their cattle graze on other people's grass, of hiring men whose primary qualification was willingness to be unpleasant, and of treating the small Mexican farming families along the river with a contempt that was specific and ugly, and had the long history of the territory's racial injustices behind it. Grace had had her own run-in with the Hargroves. She told Calvin one evening when they were sitting on the bench outside the livery watching the sun go down in its extravagant New Mexico fashion, all orange and violet and improbable. It had been 6 months after Thomas died, when she was still finding her footing with the business. Burl Hargrove had come to the livery with some vague business about her buying out the stable lease, a lease she owned outright and not leased at all, and when she had politely explained this, he had offered to help her understand the business realities of being a woman alone in a frontier town, which was not an offer she had found helpful. "What did you do?" Calvin asked. "I picked up the awl I had been working with," Grace said, "and I set it very deliberately on the table between us, and told him that I had learned from a lawyer in Santa Fe that the territorial statutes were quite clear about a widow's right to her husband's property, and that I had the deed recorded, and that if he came into my stable again speaking to me in that particular tone, I would find the occasion to record that as well with Judge Whitmore, who had been in this territory long enough to have feelings about the Hargrove family's methods." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "And did he go?" "He went," Grace said. "Burl Hargrove is a bully, and bullies make calculations. I was more trouble than I was worth, and he found other people to trouble." She looked out at the sunset. "I think about the Garza family, though. Adolfo and his wife Marta. They have a little farm 4 miles out on the east side of the river, and the Hargroves have been pushing at them for 2 years. Nobody records anything on their behalf." Calvin heard this. He filed it away with the quiet deliberateness of a man who would come back to a thing when the time was right. The days in Harlan's Crossing settled into a pattern that Calvin had not had in his adult life, which was the pattern of a man who was in a place rather than moving through it. He finished the freight work for Frank Hensler and found more work easily. Pete Dawson at the blacksmith needed help with a fence project, and the livery always had tasks that needed doing, and Calvin found himself spending most of his days near Grace in a working companionship that was comfortable and easy, and also, he was increasingly aware, not a thing he wanted to stop. He liked watching her work. He liked the economy of her movements, the way she never wasted effort, the way her hands moved over leather or wood or the mane of a nervous horse with the same unhurried sureness. He liked the way she laughed, which she did not do constantly but which, when it came, was full and genuine, and surprised you a little if you were not prepared for it. He liked talking to her at the end of the day. She had strong opinions, offered without apology, about how the town ought to handle its water rights before the summer drought, about the territorial politics, about a piece she had read in a month-old newspaper from Albuquerque about a woman in Missouri who had started a school. She was not a woman who needed the world to agree with her, which meant she did not need Calvin to agree with her either, and there was something deeply restful about that. 3 weeks after his return to Harlan's Crossing, on a warm Tuesday in late May, Calvin went with Grace in her small wagon to make a delivery of mended tack to a rancher named Willis Coburn who lived 12 miles south of town. It was a long enough drive to be proper company, and the day was fine, and the Cimarron country was at its best in the late spring. The cottonwoods heavy with new leaf, the grass along the river green and tall, the bluffs to the east catching the morning light like orange paper. They drove and they talked, and they were easy with each other in the way of people who have stopped performing and started simply being present. Around the noon hour they stopped by the creek to eat the food Grace had brought, and Calvin discovered she made a cornbread that was quietly extraordinary, and he told her so, and she said her mother had taught her, and they talked about mothers for a while, which was the kind of conversation that only happened when trust had built to a certain point. On the way back, the wagon wheel caught a rut on a stretch of track that had been softened by recent rain, and the left rear wheel dropped hard. No damage, but they both stepped down to assess, and Calvin went to check the wheel and Grace went to speak to the horses, and when Calvin stood up from the wheel and turned around, Grace was close because the track was narrow, and they were suddenly looking at each other at a distance that was different from the distance of working companionship. The light was coming in gold and long, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look like something worth remembering. Calvin was looking at her and Grace was looking at him, and neither of them moved for a moment that was short in clock time and long in every other way. "The wheel is fine," Calvin said, which was not what he was thinking. "Good," Grace said, which was not what she was thinking either. They climbed back onto the wagon and drove the rest of the way back to Harlan's Crossing, and the distance between them on the wagon seat was the same as it had been all day, but it felt different now, the way the air feels different before rain charged, aware of itself. That night Calvin lay on his bunk at the boarding house where he had taken a room and thought about Grace Monroe with the seriousness and helplessness of a man who knows something has happened to him and is working out what to do about it. He was 34 years old and he had not been in love before, or if he had not been in a position to recognize it for what it was, which amounted to the same thing in practice. He understood horses and cattle and the long grammar of the open range. He did not have a confident vocabulary for this. What he knew was that he had turned a horse around because of a stitch. What he understood, lying in the dark with the Cimarron outside and the town breathing around him, was that the stitch had been the occasion but not the reason, and the reason was something he would have to find words for eventually, because Grace Monroe was not a woman who would want him to be inarticulate about important things. The situation with the Hargrove brothers came to a head in June, not because Calvin had gone looking for it, but because things that had been building for a long time often resolved themselves in the vicinity of a new element, the way a fever breaks. It was Adolfo Garza who came to the livery on a Monday morning, hat in hand, speaking to Calvin in the combination of Spanish and English that was the working language of the territory, explaining with the carefully contained fury of a man who had been absorbing mistreatment for too long that Cole Hargrove had ridden through his cornfield the previous week with 3 of his hired men, not by accident but by design, and that when Adolfo had gone to the Hargrove ranch to speak about it, he had been told to thank them for the fertilizer. And Judge Whitmore, Calvin asked. Adolfo's expression said everything without words. The judge was a reasonable man, but a judge in a territory where the Hargroves held notes on half the local commerce moved at a deliberate pace. Calvin heard this out. Then he went and found Pete Dawson and Frank Hensler and 3 other men in the town who had their own grievances with the Hargroves and who had perhaps been waiting for someone to organize the will to act on them. He spent 2 days doing nothing dramatic, just talking, listening, assembling the particular kind of collective understanding that makes a group of individuals into something more coherent. Then he rode out to the Hargrove Ranch with a written petition, drafted carefully by Calvin, with assistance from a copy of the territorial statutes he borrowed from Judge Whitmore's own bookshelf, through the judge, who was not unsympathetic but who wanted the thing done formally and on paper. The petition laid out specific grievances from specific named plaintiffs, with specific damages described, and requested compensation and cessation, and it was backed by signatures from 15 men in and around Harlan's Crossing, including 2 who had been doing business with the Hargroves and had stopped. Burl Hargrove read the petition with the expression of a man who was accustomed to things going his way and was recalibrating. Cole stood behind him looking unpleasant. The hired man at the door, a wide-shouldered individual named Dieter, watched Calvin with the specific attentiveness of someone deciding whether a situation required him to act. Calvin stood on the Hargrove porch and was not doing anything threatening, because the situation did not require it. He was a man who had spent his life reading the weight of things: cattle, weather, men. And what he read in Burl Hargrove was not someone who wanted an actual fight. Burl wanted profit and deference, and he was intelligent enough to understand that a formal petition with 15 names on it, being reviewed by Judge Whitmore, was a different kind of problem than a single angry Mexican farmer. "I will take this under consideration," Burl Hargrove said. "I appreciate that," Calvin said. "Adolfo Garza's field represents most of what his family will eat this year. He will be making his own assessment of your consideration within the fortnight." He rode back to Harlan's Crossing without incident, and within 10 days the Garza family received a cash payment for the damage to the field, and the Hargrove cattle were moved to the north pasture in a manner that kept them well away from the East River families. It was not justice of the sweeping variety. It was the practical, incremental kind, which was the kind that actually changed day-to-day life for real people. Adolfo Garza came to the livery to tell Grace about it, because Grace was someone Adolfo trusted, and also because Adolfo was perceptive. He said something in rapid Spanish that made Grace laugh and then look at Calvin with an expression that she then regulated into something more composed. "What did he say?" Calvin asked after Adolfo had gone. "He said you are a man who understands which battles to fight with noise and which to fight with paper," Grace said. "That is very generous," Calvin said. "He also said his wife Marta wants to invite you for supper," Grace said, "and that you should bring me." Calvin looked at her. She was looking at the ledger on the counter with apparent concentration. "Would you come?" he asked. "I have been to Marta's table before," Grace said. "Her cooking is remarkable." She paused. "I would come." It was a proper supper, the kind that involved the whole Garza family, Adolfo and Marta, their 3 children ranging from 7 to 14, Marta's mother who spoke no English but communicated warmth at considerable volume, and 2 neighbors who had also benefited from the petition resolution. The table was set outdoors because the evening was fine, and the food was extraordinary, the kind of home cooking that had been refined through generations of absolute necessity into something close to art. Marta made Calvin feel that coming to her table was one of the better decisions he had made in recent memory, which was saying something given the competition from turning his horse around in late April. Calvin sat across from Grace that evening and watched her with the Garza children, who were fond of her in the uncomplicated way of children who have decided someone is good. She helped the youngest girl with a knot in a piece of braided leather she was working on, speaking to her at child's eye level with the same patience she gave to difficult horses. The 14-year-old boy, Eduardo, was asking Calvin intense questions about cattle drives and trail life, and Calvin answered honestly, including the parts that were hard and cold and boring, because Eduardo deserved the truth rather than a performance. Walking back to town in the late evening, they had taken the wagon out, but the night was so fine that they tied the horses slowly and walked the last half-mile. Calvin said what he had been building toward for weeks with the careful accumulation of a man who does not speak until he has the words right. "I have been thinking about staying," he said. "Longer than a season, here in Harlan's Crossing." Grace walked beside him on the road that was pale in the moonlight, her boots making the quiet sound of boots on dry earth. She did not respond immediately, which was her way, and he had learned to trust her silences as things that contained real thought rather than discomfort. "What would you do?" she asked. "You are a cattle man." "There is cattle work in the territory," Calvin said. "There are 3 ranches within 2 days of here that need men who know the work. I would not need to go far for driving work." He paused, "And there is plenty to do in and around town for a man with 2 hands and a willingness to use them." Grace was quiet again for a few steps. "Calvin," she said. "Yes." "Are you telling me you want to stay in Harlan's Crossing, or are you telling me something else?" He stopped walking. She stopped because he stopped and turned to face him, and the moonlight was sufficient to see her clearly, the serious set of her mouth, the careful, honest eyes that were waiting for him to say the real thing. "I am telling you something else," Calvin said. "I am telling you that I turned around on that road in April because I felt the stitch you put in my saddle, and I knew you had fixed something without being asked, and without wanting any occasion made of it, and that felt like something I had been looking for without having a name for it." He stopped. "I am not a man who talks well about this kind of thing." "You are doing fine," Grace said quietly. "I am telling you that I would like to stay because you are here," Calvin said, "and I would like to know if that is something you are willing to consider." Grace looked at him for a long time. The night insects were making their sound in the grass beside the road, and a horse somewhere in the dark made a soft sound, and the Cimarron moved over its stones the way it always had, indifferent to human matters but oddly companionable. "Thomas has been gone 2 years," Grace said. She said it not as a deflection but as a laying out of the territory, an honest accounting. "I am not still in mourning in the way of fresh grief. I have gotten used to being alone in the way that you get used to it when you have no alternative, and I had decided, not deliberately but practically, that alone was what I was." She paused. "And then you came back from the trail because you felt a stitch." "I did," Calvin said. "I have been trying to figure out what to do with that ever since," Grace admitted. "Because it seems like a small thing, but it did not feel small." "It was not small," Calvin said. She reached out then and took hold of his hand, which was the first time they had touched with intention, and his hand closed around hers with the certainty of a thing that had been anticipated so long it required no adjustment. "I am willing to consider it," Grace said, carefully, "because I am not a woman who makes reckless decisions about important things." "I know," Calvin said. "I would not want you to." They walked the rest of the way to town hand in hand, and it was the simplest and most significant walk Calvin Redmond had ever taken, which covered a distance of perhaps a quarter-mile, and seemed both entirely brief and somehow lasting. The summer in Harlan's Crossing was hot in the manner of the high desert, where the heat had a particular quality of absoluteness. Not humid and pressing like the heat further south, but direct and complete, the sun arriving each morning with total authority. Calvin had picked up work with the Brower Ranch east of town, doing general ranch work and helping with the summer cattle management, which kept him occupied during the weeks and brought him back to town on weekends and sometimes on Wednesday evenings when the ranch work allowed. He and Grace had a rhythm now that they had found together, the way 2 people find a rhythm, by trial and attention and small negotiations that are mostly wordless. He ate supper at her kitchen table on Saturdays and sometimes Sundays. They went to church together, which was a practical statement in a small town. Everyone saw it and understood it and had opinions, most of which were favorable, because Grace was well regarded and Calvin had done the Garza business, and both of these things counted. Dr. Elias Croft told Calvin directly, without embarrassment, that Grace Monroe was the best woman in the county, and that Calvin would be a fool to let her get away, which was not subtle but was genuine. Old Clara Vasquez, who had been friends with Grace since Thomas died, squeezed Calvin's arm in the churchyard one Sunday and said something in rapid Spanish that he understood enough of to catch the word for worthy, which he found unexpectedly moving. The trouble was that the approach of the serious question, the question that would change the shape of both their lives, was complicated by the things Calvin carried and had not said. He had not said them because the summer had been good, and he had not wanted to bring weight into what was light. But he was not a man who could sustain the dishonesty of omission indefinitely about things that mattered. He told her on a Thursday evening in early August, when the heat had broken slightly, and they were sitting on the bench outside the livery with glasses of cold water from the well, watching the bats come out over the river in the blue hour between sunset and dark. He told her that he had been engaged once years ago, a woman in Texas named Ada, and that she had married someone else, a banker in San Antonio, not because of any particular failure on Calvin's part, but because Calvin had been a drifting cattle man with no fixed place and she had wanted a fixed life, and both of them had been right about what they needed. He had not understood until later that the ending had left him with a scar not of heartbreak, exactly, but of a particular cautiousness, a reluctance to reach for things that required him to be somewhere specifically and reliably. "I am telling you this," Calvin said, "because I want you to know where the hesitation has come from, and I want you to know that I have looked at the hesitation and I understand it is not about you and not about what I want. It is about something old that I have been carrying and I have put it down." He looked at the river. "I am telling you because you deserve to know the whole of it." Grace was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thomas did not die easily, Calvin." It was a long 6 weeks, and at the end of it I sat with him every night and I talked to him even when he could not answer, and I told him things I had not said before because there was no more time to wait for the right occasion. She paused. "I learned from that not to wait on things that are true and important. It is good that you told me." "I should have told you sooner," Calvin said. "You told me now," Grace said. "That is what matters." He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in September, when the cottonwoods had just begun to turn gold, and the mornings had the first cool edge of the coming autumn. He asked her properly, standing in the kitchen where they had eaten their first breakfast together, with the morning light coming through the window the way it did that time of year, clean and direct, and without the heat's distortion. He had bought a ring in Las Vegas on his last run with the Brower outfit, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had seen in a jeweler's case and thought looked exactly right, the blue-green of it like the color of Grace's eyes, which he had now spent enough time looking at to know precisely. Grace looked at the ring and looked at Calvin, and her eyes were bright in a way he had not seen before, which was not tears exactly, but was something close to the same thing in a different direction. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was Grace Monroe and directness was her nature, "I was beginning to wonder when you were going to ask." Calvin laughed, which happened more readily now than it had in April, and the sound of it felt to both of them like something finally open. They were married on a Saturday in October, at the small church on the main street of Harlan's Crossing, with the whole town invited, because in a town of 200 there was no practical distinction between a public and a private occasion. Marta Garza made 3 cakes. Adolfo played guitar in the churchyard after the ceremony with 2 other men, and the music went on until the sun was completely down, and then some. Grace's sister Clara had come down from Santa Fe with her husband and children, which filled the small house behind the livery with a noise and domesticity that Grace had not experienced in 2 years, and found she had missed more than she knew. Clara held Calvin's hand in both of hers when she arrived and looked at him very carefully, the way a sister looks at the man her sister has chosen, and then she nodded as if she had asked a question she had not voiced and gotten an answer she found satisfactory. Calvin's sister Ruth, in Colorado, sent a letter that arrived the week before the wedding, thick with warmth and relief, and mild accusation that he had not told her sooner, along with a length of fine, embroidered ribbon that had been their mother's, and that Ruth said Grace should have, because their mother had wanted Calvin to find someone worthy of it. Grace pinned the ribbon into her hair on her wedding day, and Calvin, standing at the front of the church watching her walk toward him with the October light coming through the plain glass windows in bars of gold, thought about his mother and felt her absence as a specific shape, the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, and then felt something like gratitude that was beyond his ability to express cleanly and that he stored away to carry with him. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Thomas Alcott, who was 70 years old and had married more couples in the territory than he could count, and who said the words with the weight of someone who believed them thoroughly. When he reached the part about the keeping of each other, Calvin said it looking at Grace, not at the Reverend, and Grace said it looking at Calvin, and everyone in the small wooden church felt the specific warmth of watching two people mean what they were saying. They had a wedding night in the house behind the livery, and the world did not need to know the particulars of it, and in any case the particulars were private. The way a person comes home, the way two lives that have been running in parallel find the place where they run together instead. There was tenderness, and there was laughter, and there was the long, honest, complicated work of two people who had both known loss beginning to trust the possibility of something that might last. The autumn moved into winter with the deliberateness of the desert country, where the cold came on clear and dry rather than gray and wet, and the sky in December over the Cimarron was the kind of blue that seemed to have been polished. Calvin took a wintering contract with the Brower Ranch, which kept him busy during the weekdays and returned him to Grace each evening, and the house behind the livery became, incrementally, a house that held two people, his boots by the door, his coat on the second hook, the particular way he made coffee in the morning which was different from Grace's way, but which she came to associate so completely with him that, when he was gone before she woke, she could smell it and feel less alone. Grace continued the leather shop through the winter with the addition of a line of work that Calvin had suggested, and which turned out to be good business. Saddlebags and gun belts and harness work, the heavier tack that local ranches sent out because they did not have a skilled leather worker on staff. She had always done this work but had not marketed it specifically, and with Calvin's help, which consisted primarily of him talking to men he worked with on the ranches about where they sent their tack repairs, and suggesting an alternative, the business grew in a satisfying and manageable way. They were happy. This is worth saying plainly, without the hedging that tends to surround happiness in stories, because happiness is harder to render dramatically than suffering. They were genuinely and without qualification happy, in the way of two people who had each known enough difficulty to understand what contentment was worth. They argued sometimes, because they were both people of strong opinion, and the arguments were honest and contained and ended with understanding. They disagreed about money management, because Calvin tended to spend when he had it and Grace kept meticulous accounts, and they needed to find the middle ground between his ease and her caution, which they did by Grace keeping the household accounts, and Calvin seeing immediately that this was a better system than any alternative and not arguing about it. They disagreed once, significantly, about whether Calvin should take a long drive contract that would take him away for 2 months in the spring, and the disagreement was really about something older and harder: Grace's knowledge that things she counted on had a history of being taken from her, and Calvin's need to find the right words to say that he was different from a fever, that he had agency about returning, that he chose her daily, with intention. "I am not Thomas," Calvin said in the middle of that argument, and then stopped because the sentence was more direct than he had intended. Grace stopped too. The kitchen was quiet. "No," she said, "you are not." She sat down at the table. "I know that, I know it here." She put her hand on her chest. "But the place that is afraid does not always know the things the reasonable part knows." Calvin sat down across from her. "Tell me what would help," he said. I'm not going anywhere without your knowing the full truth of it. She thought about it honestly. Tell me the route, she said. Tell me the stops. Write to me from each one. Come home on the day you say you will come home. I can do all of those things, Calvin said. All of them. He went on the drive. He wrote from Springer, from Raton, from Trinidad. The letters were not poetic. They were accounts of the drive, of weather and cattle and the men he was working with, of specific details that said I was here, and I was thinking of you without necessarily deploying those exact words. He came home on the day he had said, which was an ordinary Saturday in late June with the summer fully established, riding the roan through the main street of Harlan's Crossing in the late afternoon, and seeing Grace standing in the doorway of the livery stable, because she had known approximately when to expect him. He rode up and dismounted, and she was already stepping forward, and they held each other in the manner of people for whom reunion has a physical reality, and the roan stood patient behind them and probably felt the whole scene was beneath his notice. You wrote from every stop, Grace said into his shoulder. I said I would, Calvin said. I know, she said. It matters that you did. By the following spring, in 1884, Grace was expecting their first child, and the news rearranged everything in the best possible way. The livery was doing well enough that Calvin was able to hire a part-time hand, a 17-year-old boy named Jose Luis Garza, Adolfo's eldest, who had grown into a steady and capable young man, and who regarded the opportunity with a seriousness that made both Grace and Calvin feel the rightness of it. Grace kept working through the summer, because she was not built for idleness, and the work itself was not beyond her as long as she was sensible about the heavy lifting, which Calvin took over without discussion. The child was born in November of 1884, a boy, arriving with the emphatic announcement common to first children who have been preparing for their debut. Dr. Croft was present and calm and entirely competent, and Clara Vasquez was also present because she had told Grace months ago she would be, and Grace had not argued, knowing that she would want a woman she trusted in the room. Calvin waited outside the bedroom door in the manner of all expectant fathers, making himself useful where he could, which was not much, and being honest with himself about the quality of his fear, which was real and specific and attached to the oldest of all human vulnerabilities, the people you love existing in the world, where the world can get at them. When Dr. Croft opened the door and said that everything had gone well and Calvin could come in, Calvin crossed the threshold and saw Grace sitting up in bed with a small red-faced person in her arms, and he had to stop walking for a moment because the weight of what he was looking at required him to reassemble himself before he could move. Come here, Grace said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms with the confidence of a woman who trusted him completely, and Calvin held his son. It was a boy, the doctor had already said, and felt the specific gravity of a brand new person who was going to need everything, Calvin had, and found that he had it. What do you want to call him? Grace asked. Calvin looked at the baby. William, he said. For my father. He looked at her. If that is all right with you. William Thomas Redmond, Grace said, adding her own piece of it. For both of them. Yes, Calvin said, for both of them. William Thomas Redmond was a healthy and loud and eventually charming child who took his first steps in the livery stable at 13 months and spent much of his early years following Calvin around with the dedicated imitation of a small person who has identified his primary model. He developed a specific bond with the roan gelding, which was old now but patient and tolerant of toddlers, and which Calvin suspected had a better understanding of human beings than most human beings did. The town of Harlan's Crossing continued its stubborn surviving. Frank Hensler expanded the mercantile. Hector Ruiz, the farrier, took on a younger partner and began handling the farrier work for 4 of the local ranches. The Garza family's farm was doing well, and Eduardo Garza, now 17, was talking about the possibility of his own place someday, which made Adolfo visibly proud in the way of men who grew up with very little and find their children building more. The Hargrove brothers continued to be the Hargrove brothers, but the petition business had established a precedent and a calibration, and their worst behaviors remained somewhat contained within the understanding that Harlan's Crossing now had a vocabulary for resistance. Calvin kept the relationship with them neutral and businesslike, because neutral and businesslike was what the situation required. He did not like Burl Hargrove, and Burl Hargrove did not like him, and both of them understood this clearly and had decided not to make a production of it, which was a kind of prairie statesmanship that Calvin had come to believe was underrated. In the spring of 1886, Ruth came from Colorado to visit. She came with her husband, a quiet, prosperous man named Douglas Aldrich who was in the mining business, and their two daughters, 10 and 8, who took immediately to William, who was now a year and a half and felt the presence of older girls as a complex social challenge that he attacked with the single-minded charisma of a child who had been the center of his universe and was now discovering that the universe had extensions. Ruth and Grace took to each other in the way Calvin had hoped, but had been cautious about assuming. They were different women. Ruth was more openly expressive, more inclined to sentiment and declaration, where Grace was measured and interior. But they were both perceptive and direct and honest, and they found each other's company immediately worthwhile. On the second evening of the visit, Calvin sat on the bench outside the livery with Douglas Aldrich, who was a decent man without much talk in him, and they watched the sun go down over the Cimarron, while the sound of Ruth's and Grace's voices came through the kitchen window in the warm, specific music of women who have decided they like each other and are making up for lost time. "She is remarkable, your wife," Douglas said. "She is," Calvin agreed. "Ruth has been worried about you since Ada," Douglas said, in the direct way of a man who had decided Calvin could handle it. "She will sleep better now." Calvin thought about Ada briefly and without pain, which was itself remarkable if you considered where he had stood years ago. "I did not know my own luck until I turned a horse around on a road," Calvin said. Douglas looked at him, waiting for more explanation, but Calvin did not offer any, because some things were their own complete story and did not need elaboration. By the summer of 1887, Grace was expecting again, and this time she was not afraid in the same way, because she had the map of it already. She knew what the fear was and where it came from, and that it was not the same as the thing happening. She was 36 now, and Calvin was 39, and they had been married 6 years, and those 6 years had the weight and substance of a life genuinely built, not fallen into. Calvin, for his part, had transitioned almost entirely from drive work to local ranch management. He was now the foreman of the Brower Ranch, a position that Elias Brower had been wanting to give him for 2 years, and that Calvin had finally accepted because the position allowed him to be home every night and still do the work he knew. He was good at the management of it, the crew, the animals, the land, the particular administrative patience required to keep a cattle operation running without constant drama. Elias Brower was a reasonable employer, and the arrangement had become something close to a partnership in practice, which suited both men. The second child arrived in February of 1888, a girl this time, born on a cold, clear morning when the Cimarron was running low and the cottonwoods were bare, and she arrived with considerably less drama than William had, as if she had decided efficiency was the approach and had executed accordingly. They named her Alina for no one specific, just because it was the name they both agreed on immediately and without discussion, which sometimes happens with names the way it sometimes happens with people, which is that recognition arrives before explanation. William, 3 years old at the time of Alina's arrival, received his sister with the cautious suspicion of a small person whose world has just been rearranged without his consent, and then with the gradually increasing interest of a child discovering that small people do things, And then, with the deep and abiding loyalty of an older brother who has decided this particular small person is his to protect. It was a beautiful thing to watch develop over the months that followed. The way the two of them found their relationship, Alina fearless and curious, William already with some of Calvin's quiet steadiness. The two of them together making a combination that kept Grace and Calvin in a constant state of alert affection. On a warm evening in the May of 1888, when Alina was 3 months old and William was walking around the yard with the gravity of a child who had made important decisions about the direction of his future, Calvin found Grace sitting on the bench outside the livery in the last of the light. Alina was asleep in the small cradle that had been left just inside the stable door where Grace could hear her. The stable itself was quiet at this hour, the horses settled for the night. Calvin sat beside her, and she leaned against him with the comfortable weight of someone who has stopped performing ease and found the real thing. The Cimarron made its sound over the stones. The mountains to the east were purple in the failing light. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Grace asked. "The morning you came in with the saddle." "Often," Calvin said. "I did not think twice about it," Grace said. "I just picked up the awl, it needed doing." "I know," Calvin said. "That is exactly what I mean." She turned her face toward him and he could see her in the side light, the way the years had settled into her features, not as aging exactly but as depth, the same eyes, the same steady regard, but with more in them now because there was more to hold. "I was so certain you would just ride on," she said. "Men come through this town and they ride on. That is the nature of a trail town." "I was going to," Calvin said. "I had 3 miles done. And then you felt the stitch." "And then I felt the stitch," Calvin agreed. Grace smiled, the full smile, the one that had surprised him when he first saw it, the one that still surprised him a little every time because it was so complete, so unguarded. "I have thought about what would have happened if I had not repaired it," she said, "if I had just watched you ride out." "The saddle would have failed on the trail," Calvin said. "Yes," Grace said, "and you would not have come back." "No," Calvin said. He was quiet for a moment. "And William would not exist. And Alina would not exist. And I would be somewhere in Colorado right now or Texas, doing work I know how to do, surrounded by nothing that mattered." Grace reached for his hand, the same gesture she had made on that moonlit road 6 years ago, and his hand closed around hers with the same certainty. "I am glad I picked up the awl," she said. "So am I," Calvin said. "Every day." They sat in the warm May evening, and the bats came out over the river, and the town made its quiet sounds around them, and Alina made a small sleeping sound from the cradle just inside the door, and William could be heard somewhere in the yard narrating a private drama to himself in the complete and serious voice of a 3-year-old who has important things to say. Calvin thought about the road. The roan beneath him and the morning light in the cottonwoods, and the feeling under his left thigh of something right where there had been something wrong. He thought about turning the horse around not because he had to, not because the saddle was so badly damaged he could not have ridden, but because the feeling of something carefully mended was so specific and intentional that he had needed to account for it. He had needed to find the person who had done the mending and look at them directly. He had looked at Grace Monroe directly and found everything. The months that followed were months of ordinary wonder, which is the highest praise that can be given to ordinary life, that it is so full of the specific, and the irreplaceable that the wonder of it never quite becomes routine. William started at the small school that the town had finally established in a proper building, taught by a young woman from Missouri, named Miss Elise Park, who had the firm and joyful approach to instruction of a person who had chosen her vocation absolutely. He took to learning with a focused appetite that made both his parents quietly proud, although Calvin was careful not to become the sort of father who made his pride conditional, because the pride was not conditional. It was for William himself, independent of what William achieved. Alina, growing rapidly into toddlerhood, had decided that the livery stable was her primary domain. She had inherited Grace's ease with animals, and spent her available hours in conversation with the horses that came through, talking to them with the gravity of a small person conducting serious business. The horses, in the way of horses, responded to her with the same trust they gave Grace, which was the most accurate assessment of character that Calvin could imagine. Grace's sister Clara came for a long visit in the autumn of 1888, bringing her children, who were now in their early teens, and who found William and Alina fascinating in the way that older children find very young children fascinating before they understand why. Clara and Grace walked in the evenings and talked in the way of sisters who have been separated by distance and time, and are reclaiming the intimacy of knowing each other, and Calvin gave them that space easily, because he understood that some things were not about him, and were not supposed to be. Clara told Calvin, privately, at the end of her visit, that Grace had always been the strongest person she knew, but that strength without someone to set it beside was just endurance. "You gave her someone to set it beside," Clara said. "I am glad." Calvin did not have an elegant response to this, so he just said that he was glad too, which was true and complete. The Brower Ranch continued to grow under Calvin's management, which meant his reputation extended outward, and by 1889 he had been offered positions at larger outfits further away and had turned them all down, without particular drama, because the calculation was simple and he had already made it. There was nothing at any distance that was worth more than this specific life in this specific place. He did make one significant change in 1889, which was that he began building. The house behind the livery was sufficient but small, and with 2 children and the occasional visiting family member, its limitations were becoming clear. Calvin started the new house on the lot adjacent to the livery that Grace owned, starting with the foundation in March and working on it in the evenings and on Sundays, with help from Pete Dawson and from Eduardo Garza, who had developed a genuine aptitude for carpentry and treated the project with the enthusiasm of someone learning a craft he intended to master. It took the better part of a year. They moved in at Christmas of 1889, which was not planned as a symbolic occasion but became one anyway, because Grace walked through the new house on moving day with Alina on her hip and William darting from room to room announcing the purposes of each space, and she stopped in the kitchen, the generous kitchen with the east-facing window that Calvin had built specifically so she would have morning light while she worked, and she was quiet for a long moment. "Calvin," she said. "Yes," he said from the doorway. "You built a window for the morning light," she said. "You are in the kitchen in the mornings," Calvin said. "You deserve good light." Grace set Alina down carefully, and Alina immediately went to investigate the window sill with the focused attention of a toddler cataloging new territory. Grace turned and looked at Calvin, and the look was one of those complete ones that needed no translation, that said everything without requiring the words, and Calvin held it with the same completeness. "Come here," she said. He came across the kitchen, and she put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the new house that he had built for her while the children made noise in the other rooms, and outside the Cimarron was making its sound over the stones the way it always had, indifferent to human matters but reliably present, which was not unlike love itself, not always attending to the specific occasion, but constant and running underneath everything, reliable in its return. The house filled up over the years the way good houses do, with the accumulation of living, with the marks that children make on walls and door frames, with the smell of coffee and leather and wood smoke, with the particular harmony of objects that belong somewhere and know it. The ledger of daily life in Harlan's Crossing and on the Brower Ranch, and in the leather shop continued in the way that good lives continue, not without difficulty, because difficulty is not the enemy of a good life, but with the sustaining presence of 2 people who had decided on each other and kept deciding, morning by morning, with the same intention that Grace had brought to a saddle stitch on an April morning in 1882. The roan gelding, that patient horse who had carried Calvin through the turning point of his life and back again, lived to a considerable age for a working horse, 21 years old when he finally went, on a morning in 1891, found peacefully in his stall at the Brower Ranch. Calvin buried him at the edge of the pasture under a cottonwood, which was not the kind of thing a man necessarily advertised, but which Grace understood without needing it explained. She said nothing about it until the evening, when she set a cup of coffee beside Calvin where he was sitting at the kitchen table with a quietness she recognized. "He was a good horse," she said. "He was the best horse I ever rode," Calvin said. "He turned around when you turned around," Grace said. "He did," Calvin said. "He picked up the coffee. He was smarter than me in some respects." "Most horses are," Grace said, which was the right thing to say, and Calvin laughed. By 1892, William was 7 years old and Alina was 4, and both of them had begun to take on the particular characters that were going to carry them through their lives. William was earnest and thorough, and had his father's way of observing before speaking, and had also inherited Grace's hands the spatial intelligence, the ability to see how things fit together. He had already, at 7, begun mending small pieces of tack under Grace's supervision, with an aptitude that made her both proud and quietly emotional, because she recognized the hands at work. Alina was fearless in the particular way of a small person who has never been given a reason to doubt her own capacity, which was the best gift her parents had given her. She had already announced, at the age of 4, her intention to be a veterinarian, which was a word she had learned from Dr. Croft and which she deployed with complete authority. Dr. Croft, who came by the livery regularly and was by this time 70 years old and still working, told Alina with perfect seriousness that she had the right aptitude for it and that she should read everything she could find. "There are women veterinarians," Grace asked Croft privately because she genuinely did not know. "There will be," Croft said firmly. "The world is changing." Grace thought about this and found it satisfying, and then went back to the piece of harness she was working on. In the summer of 1893, Harlan's Crossing got a telegraph office, which connected it to the wider world in a way that changed the texture of its isolation without eliminating it. You could now receive news from Santa Fe or Denver, or even the eastern cities within hours of its occurring, which was both useful and occasionally more information than a small frontier town particularly needed. Calvin used it primarily for ranch business, and Grace used it once to send a message to her sister in Santa Fe that simply said both children well, husband excellent, life good, which was short enough to be economical and long enough to be true. Calvin's 40th birthday came in 1893, and Grace organized a dinner of such scale and warmth that the dining room of the new house was barely sufficient, with the Garza family present and Pete Dawson and Clara Vasquez and Frank Hensler and Elias Brower and Dr. Croft, and a dozen others who had become, in the 11 years since Calvin had first ridden into Harlan's Crossing on a tired roan horse, the community that constituted his world. Adolfo Garza made a small speech, in his combination of Spanish and English, about the petition business and about what Calvin had done for the families along the river, and about the kind of man who used paper where other men used noise, and Calvin was grateful and embarrassed in equal measure and said so, and everyone laughed. Grace gave him, last of all, a gift wrapped in plain paper, a tooled leather journal made by her own hands. The cover worked in a pattern that took him a moment to identify and then did identify. The running stitch pattern of the saddle stitch, rendered decoratively, unmistakably. He looked at it and then looked at her. "You do not forget where you came from," Grace said with the private smile that was for him alone. "I could not forget," Calvin said. "Not if I tried." He had not tried. He had no inclination to try. The story of his life had a clear beginning, marked as clearly as any place on a map, and the mark was a stitch in a saddle on a spring morning in 1882, made by a woman who had not been asked, who had seen something that needed doing and had done it thoroughly and well and without fuss. He had felt it on the trail. He had turned his horse around. Everything else, William and Alina, the house with the morning window, the suppers at the Garza table, the years of work and ease and argument and reconciliation, and the daily choosing of each other, all of it had grown from that turning. The way the Cimarron grew from snowmelt in the mountains, arriving at the flat country with no particular drama, and sustaining everything in its path. The autumn of 1894 brought a new development that none of them had anticipated. A traveling schoolmaster named Robert Dayton arrived in Harlan's Crossing with the intention of establishing a proper secondary school, and he came with enough funding from a Santa Fe benefactor to make the intention serious. The existing school, under Miss Park, handled the primary grades well, but there was nothing for older children, and the families of the territory who wanted their children educated past the basics sent them away to Santa Fe or Albuquerque, or didn't send them at all. Calvin was on the committee that helped Dayton find the building and establish the curriculum, and Grace contributed materially. She donated the labor of Grace and Jose Luis in fitting out the school's workshop, a practical space where older students could learn a trade alongside the academic subjects. She believed, strongly and from her own experience, that the hands and the mind were not separate educations. Eduardo Garza, 26 years old now and running his own small carpentry operation, came in to help with the workshop installation and spent a long morning working alongside Grace while Calvin handled the administrative side of the school project. Watching Eduardo work, the skill of it, the ease, the way he had taken the aptitude he had shown as a teenager and developed it into a genuine craft, Grace felt a specific satisfaction that was hard to name, but that had something to do with the long view, with the understanding that what you do for people echoes in directions you cannot see ahead of time. "Do you remember teaching him his first carpenter's joint?" Calvin asked her that evening. "It was a simple mortise," Grace said. "He picked it up immediately. He has built 4 houses in this county," Calvin said. "I know," Grace said. She was feeding Alina the last of her supper, and William was doing his schoolwork at the table corner, and the lamp was making its warm circle on everything. That is a good thing. It was a good thing. The town was a good thing. The life was a good thing, not in the soft and uncomplicated sense of a life without difficulty, but in the deep and real sense of a life that had been built with intention and maintained with care, between 2 people who had both understood something essential from the beginning, that nothing worth having was built once. It was built daily. It was the daily stitch, the daily returning, the daily choice to be where you were with the people you had chosen. In the November of 1895, Grace discovered she was expecting again, which was a surprise to both of them. William was 10, Alina was 7, and they had not anticipated another. The surprise turned quickly into something else, something that had a quality of grace about it in the truest sense, an unearned gift arriving exactly when it was least expected. Dr. Croft, who had been their doctor through both previous arrivals, was now 72 years old and in the final year of his practice. He told Grace she was healthy and that there was no reason to anticipate difficulty, and then he told her he was glad he had stayed in the territory long enough to see this, which Grace understood to be a farewell of sorts, not from this world, but from the active portion of it. Calvin sat with that knowledge. He had a particular respect for Elias Croft that was not quite like his respect for other people. It was the respect for a man who had spent his life in service to a community that was small and poor and difficult, and who had done it without complaint or accumulated grievance, because the work itself was what he had chosen, and the work itself was sufficient. The 3rd child arrived in August of 1896, on a morning of such heat that the air itself seemed reluctant to move. It was a boy, a healthy, loud, determined boy who arrived with his eyes already apparently focused on something interesting in the middle distance. They named him James, for no ancestor specifically, but because James was a name that felt like itself, complete, and Grace said it sounded like a man who would know his own mind, and Calvin said that was a good quality to cultivate. William took to James with the proprietary care of a 10-year-old who has decided he is the relevant authority on what a baby needed. Eleanor, 7 and authoritative on all subjects, maintained that she had been right about the baby being a boy, although she had not previously announced this prediction to anyone, which William pointed out with the precision of a child committed to accuracy. The argument was brief and warm and entirely typical. Elias Croft came to see James shortly after the birth. As much as a visit as a medical call, he had officially retired his practice 3 months prior, handing it to a younger doctor named Harriet Webb who had come from Albuquerque and who was, Calvin noted privately, exactly the kind of person Grace would have approved of a woman, technically trained, direct and competent without theater. Croft held James for a long minute, looking at him with the particular expression of an old man holding a new life, which has no adequate description but which everyone who has witnessed it recognizes immediately. "You have done well, both of you," Croft said, when he handed James back to Grace. "Not a physician's assessment, something else." "We had good materials to work with," Grace said, which was the modest version. The full version would have taken longer and required different language. Calvin walked Croft home that evening because the doctor was not as steady on his feet as he had been, and because Calvin valued the walk and the company. They went slowly along the main street of Harlan's Crossing in the late summer heat, past the mercantile and the blacksmith and the telegraph office and the new school building with Dayton's name on a modest board above the door. And Croft talked about the town as it had been when he arrived in the 1860s, before the Cimarron War, before the Lincoln County troubles, before any of it had settled into whatever this present shape was. "It is a better place than it was," Croft said. "Yes," Calvin said. "You are part of why," Croft said. "Grace more than me," Calvin said. "Together," Croft said, with the finality of a man who was done qualifying things. "Together, it means something." They were together. That was the whole of it. They were together in the specific and daily way of two people who had found their way to each other across the particular odds of a life, the losses, the distances, the years of motion that had preceded the stillness, and who had built, on the ground of a frontier town in the New Mexico territory, something that was neither glamorous nor dramatic but was profoundly, irrevocably real. The Cimarron ran its water from the mountains to the south, as it always had. The cottonwoods went gold in October and bare in November and green again in April with the reliability of something that had been doing it long before anyone was watching and would keep doing it long after. The Hargrove brothers, having reached an age where their energies were less expansive, eventually sold the northern operation and moved their money into town commerce, where they were unremarkable rather than actively damaging, which was an improvement. The Garza family's farm prospered, and Eduardo's carpentry operation became a small building company that took work across 3 counties and employed 4 men. Jose Luis Garza took over Grace's leather shop formally in 1898, buying it from her at a price they negotiated over a month of honest conversation, and the shop kept the same quality of work because Jose Luis had been trained right. Grace kept the livery through 1900, at which point she and Calvin made the practical decision together to sell the livery operation to a young couple newly arrived from Colorado, the Kendricks, Ray and Dora, who were solid and capable, while retaining the house and the leather trade connections, and the particular right to be in the town that had been earned by years of living in it honestly. William was 15 in 1900, tall and quiet and reading everything he could find, and he had announced, after a long private consideration that his parents recognized as characteristic, that he wanted to go to a proper school, a college, if such a thing could be arranged. He had his eye on the New Mexico Normal School in Las Vegas, which had been established long enough to be real and was, his teacher Dayton had confirmed, a good institution. Calvin and Grace discussed this with the particular combination of pride and appropriate melancholy that parents bring to the moment when a child's life clearly extends beyond the family circle and into the larger world. They agreed without significant debate that if William wanted this thing and had the aptitude for it, which he clearly did, then the thing to do was to make it possible. "Your mother would have been pleased," Calvin told William, meaning Grace, who was standing beside him when he said it. "You mean her mother," William said, confused. "I mean mine," Calvin said. "She wanted this for me once. I went a different direction." He looked at his son. "You go the direction you are built for." William went. He left in the autumn of 1900 for Las Vegas, and the house was quieter for it in the way that houses become quieter when the largest part of their noise walks out the door toward its future. Eleanor, 12, was practical about it. She missed her brother, but she was also now the oldest child present, which gave her an authority over James that she was not inclined to underuse. James, 4 years old and absolute in his opinions, adapted to the changed dynamics with the resilience of a small person who has never doubted that his world was fundamentally safe. The new century arrived with the New Mexico Territory still not a state. The statehood question had been pending for years and would continue to pend in the particular fashion of political processes that had many small obstacles and no single large solution. Calvin had opinions about statehood because he was a man who paid attention to governance, and Grace had sharper opinions because she was a woman who had spent 2 decades doing business in a territory where the legal protections available to her were narrower than they should have been, and the prospect of full statehood meant better constitutional ground. They talked about it at the kitchen table on the evenings when the children were in bed, in the way they talked about everything that mattered carefully, with full honesty, with the willingness to disagree and the more important willingness to hear the disagreement and think about it rather than defend against it. This was, Calvin had come to understand, the actual grammar of a good life together. Not the agreement was easy and often lazy, but the willingness to take seriously what the other person brought. Grace's perspective on the territorial politics was sharper than his own in certain respects, because she had felt the particular edges of the law in ways he had not. His perspective on the ranch and range dynamics was more precise than hers, because it came from direct daily experience. Together, they made a better understanding of the world than either of them made separately, which was the point, which was always the point. James Redmond, growing, became the most outwardly social of the 3 children, where William was internal, and Eleanor was forceful and self-directed. James moved through the world with an easy warmth that attracted people to him without effort. He had Grace's steadiness of character under it, and Calvin's observational patience under that. But the surface presentation was entirely his own, a personality nobody had predicted, and that pleased them precisely because it had arrived unexpected. Eleanor, at 15 in 1903, was deep in her self-assigned education in animal medicine, reading everything available, corresponding by letter with a veterinary practitioner in Albuquerque, and conducting what amounted to a practical apprenticeship by being present every time any animal in the Harlan's Crossing area needed medical attention. Dr. Webb, who had taken on some large animal work in addition to her medical practice, had become Eleanor's mentor in the practical way of a woman who recognized in a young woman the specific quality of vocation and did not want to see it discouraged. Calvin watched his daughter with the same particular emotion he had had watching William pursue his path, pride, and the accompanying awareness that the children you raise well are, by design and intention, going to become themselves in directions you cannot fully predict. It was what he had wanted for them. It was also, he admitted to himself honestly, something he had to consciously practice accepting when the reality of it arrived, because the instinct to keep things close was a powerful one and required deliberate management. Grace managed it better than he did. She had always understood at some deep level that love was not keeping. It was releasing, repeatedly, with intention. She had let Thomas's death teach her that. She had let Calvin's cattle drives teach her that. She let it apply now to the children growing outward, and she did it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, not without cost, but without resentment. William came home from the normal school in 1904 with a teaching certificate and the specific quality of a young man who has gone somewhere and come back changed in the ways that were supposed to change, but still himself in the ways that mattered. He was 20 now, with his father's height in his mother's eyes, and a manner that was entirely his own. He had also come back with a young woman named Patience Flores, a quiet and intelligent person from Las Vegas, whom he had been corresponding with for a year, and who came to meet his family with the steady composure of someone who had thought carefully about whether she wanted to be here, and had decided yes. Grace watched Patience the way Clara had once watched Calvin, with the honest assessment of someone who loved the person in question enough to see clearly. She told Calvin that evening, after Patience and William had gone to their respective rooms and the house was quiet, that she liked Patience. "She looks at him the way I should hope someone looks at him," Grace said. "Like he is worth the looking," Calvin said. "Yes," Grace said. "Exactly that." William took a teaching position at the Harlan's Crossing School the following year, which meant he came home not to the family house. He found his own rooms in town, but into the community, which was the best kind of coming home. He and Patience were married in 1905 in the same church where Calvin and Grace had married 23 years earlier, and Reverend Thomas Alcott, who was now elderly beyond calculation but still present and still believing what he said, performed the ceremony with the same weight he had always brought to it. Calvin stood in the churchyard after the ceremony with his son beside him, the next generation taking its place in the same ground, and felt the continuity of it, not as repetition but as depth, as layers, as the particular accumulation that constitutes a life that has been lived with intention in one place over time. "Are you happy?" Calvin asked William, because he was his father's son and asked things directly. "Completely," William said. The word landed without qualification. "Good," Calvin said. "That is all that matters." The years from 1905 through 1910 were years of fullness, a word that does not get used enough about the middle portion of a well-lived life, which tends to be the most significant portion even though it is the least dramatically narrated. Calvin and Grace were in their 50s, which in the New Mexico Territory in the early years of the 20th century was neither old nor young but was fully established, fully arrived. The Brower Ranch continued under Calvin's management and had become a model operation in the territory, referenced by other ranchers as a benchmark for responsible land and cattle management. The leather shop under Jose Luis was the best craft shop between Springer and Las Vegas. Aliner, after years of practical apprenticeship and correspondence study, was by 1908 doing formal veterinary work in and around Harlan's Crossing, one of the early women in the region to do so, which was not without friction from men who felt that this arrangement was irregular, and which was also not without the deep satisfaction of watching the friction lose, in the particular patient way that things which are simply true and right tend to win eventually. She remained in the area and built a practice that covered the river farming families as well as the ranches, and her clients included Adolfo and Marta Garza's expanded farm operation, which gave Calvin a specific pleasure every time he thought about the lineage of it, Adolfo's family, who had needed protection and gotten it, whose son Eduardo had built houses, whose daughter-in-law's cattle were now cared for by Calvin's daughter. The interlocking of lives over time, the way the choices made in one generation echoed into the next, was the deepest satisfaction he could name. James, in 1910, was 14, too young yet for the full shape of his life to be clear, but plainly heading in the direction of something commercial and social, possibly the store trade, possibly the banking side of the territory's growing economy. He was good with numbers and better with people, and he had already demonstrated, in the small economies of the schoolyard and the church social, an aptitude for making arrangements that benefited everyone involved, which was either the foundation of good business or good politics or both. New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, which was a subject that Calvin and Grace had been discussing for 15 years and which, when it finally arrived, felt to Grace like a specific and personal vindication, the ground she stood on having finally, officially, a constitution that at least nominally said she stood on equal ground. She did not make an occasion of it in front of others, because that was not her way. She said to Calvin privately on the evening after the news came, "It matters." "It does," Calvin said. "Not enough yet," she said, "but it is a beginning." "It is," Calvin agreed. And because he had been married to Grace Monroe for 30 years and had learned what that meant, he said it without qualification and without wanting to minimize the truth of the second part. The statehood celebration in Harlan's Crossing was a proper occasion, a public dinner in the main street, the new state flag hanging from every building, speeches from the mayor and from Judge Whitmore's successor, a young man named Albright who had the energy of someone who believed in the new state's potential without yet having been worn down by its limitations, which was probably the right disposition for the moment. Calvin gave no speech. He stood with Grace on the edge of the crowd and watched Harlan's Crossing celebrate itself, and he thought about the particular oddness of a life, how it came from the most unintended things, how a man could ride into a town on a tired horse with no intention of stopping, and have a woman fix his saddle without being asked, and feel it on the trail and turn around into a life that was so specifically and completely his own that no other configuration could have fit. He thought about the roan, gone these 20 years. He thought about the cottonwood on the Brower Ranch where he had buried him. He thought about Ada in San Antonio, and the banker she had married and hoped they had been happy, because happiness was not a limited resource and he had more than enough of his own. He took Grace's hand, and she curled her fingers around his in the way she had been doing for 30 years, and the statehood celebration went on around them with its noise and its flags, and Calvin Redmond was 53 years old and standing on the ground of a life that had been built from a single turned horse and a single saddle stitch, and there was not one moment of it he would have changed. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked him, because she knew that particular look on his face, the inward one. "The morning I rode in," Calvin said. "The first morning." "You looked half-starved," Grace said. "I was 3/4 starved," Calvin said. "The horse was in better shape than I was." "He was a good horse," Grace said. "The best," Calvin agreed. She leaned against him the way she had for 30 years, with the comfortable weight of someone who had stopped performing ease long ago and had found the real thing permanently. The crowd cheered something the mayor said. A child ran past them laughing at something. The mountains to the east were what they always were, permanent and violet, and entirely indifferent to the human scale of things, which was not unkind, but was just accurate. "Calvin," Grace said, "yes, I am glad you turned around." He tightened his hand on hers. Outside the words, beyond the words, in the 30 years of specific daily life that made the words unnecessary and also exactly right. "So am I," he said, "every single day." "So am I." The evening settled into night, and the stars over the New Mexico high desert came out in the multitudes that never failed to be worth looking at. And Harlan's Crossing celebrated its statehood and its existence and the stubborn fact of its survival. And Calvin and Grace Redmond stood in the middle of all of it, rooted and content and entirely, irrevocably home.